Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the 26th CCOVI Lecture Series. I'm Debbie Ingalls. I'm the Director of the Cool Climate Oenology and Viticulture Institute here at Brock University. I would also like to invite not only our guests in the room, but our virtual guests that have logged in online to watch the live webcast. Today, I'm proud to introduce CCOVI's very own viticulturist, Dr. Jim Willwerth, who's going to be speaking to us today about his latest research on bird deterrent activity in the vineyard. So Jim attained his PhD in biological sciences, specializing in plant sciences, oenology, and viticulture, and completed that back in 2011 before he joined us as a viticulturist here in the Institute. Excuse me. In his role at CCOVI, he examines viticulture topics that are identified by the grape and wine industry, and he also runs outreach programs for knowledge transfer back to the industry, and specifically mainly targeting the growers. A major component of his research program does focus on grapevine cold hardiness in the Vine Alert program. However, today he's going to talk to us about another avenue of his research and his work on bird deterrent strategies and understanding bird activity and behavior here in Ontario. I did want to just mention that Jim's outreach activities also extend to the Vintners Quality Alliance of Ontario, where he's a member of the Standards Development Committee, where they review regulations for the provincial wine industry. And he also sits on the board of directors for the American Society of Oenology and Viticulture, Eastern Section. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jim for an exciting talk today.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here today to talk or to listen to my talk today on some bird deterrent strategies that we've been working on. A lot of my work, as Debbie mentioned, focuses on grapevine cold hardiness, but there's a lot of industry-driven work, research that has been done in our lab the last couple of years. So I want to talk to you today a bit about that. We have a little break in the winter this year. It's a bit of a kinder winter, and so this is a good time to talk about some of this research. But we are doing some really exciting stuff right now on the cold hardiness front, and hopefully next year I'll be giving another talk on hardiness. But today we're focusing on the birds. So this is a project that we've been working with industry very closely with the grape growers of Ontario, with a few companies, as well as the OFVGA. So it's a culmination of really working closely with the industry on this project and dealing with a problem that's present in all over the world, just not in Ontario, but all over the world. Birds can be a real issue. And in terms of birds, they can be a hazard or just a nuisance. And they're a real hazard to the airline industry, right? Yeah. In terms of air traffic and flocks of geese, for example, they can have some serious consequences. In terms of the grape and tender and berry fruit industry, I should say, a lot of it has to do with birds preying on the food, foraging in the vineyards and the orchards, and eating a lot of the crop. And this can result to losses in fruit, but also indirect loss, because when birds peck at the fruit, for example, you can get disease into the crop, and it's an indirect loss. And a lot of this bird behavior, it can be very unpredictable. I mean, it comes from food sources, birds migrating through, just they're opportunistic, right? So it can be very unpredictable in terms of how they're going to feed. And so there is a need for good control strategies, but also ones that are not a nuisance to us as humans, because a lot of the things that birds don't like, we don't like either. And with birds and farms and urban settings all being together, they could be a bit of a problem. And I'll talk a bit about some of that right now in terms of some of the deterrents that we have. So some of these are people that aren't familiar with bird deterrents might laugh at some of these. But one of the main strategies being used are acoustical repellents, noises that startle birds, and again, they're random noises that birds don't like. So one of them are these propane cannons, or what we call them bird bangers, and they're literally a propane cannon that fire off a couple rounds of very loud bangs. And so these are very, very common. Another strategies are some of these electrical sound devices. They're bird squawkers. So there are distress calls, predator calls, and so on and so forth. Again, they're used to try to deter birds. And some of these electrical sound devices also are used to deter terrestrial animals like deer and so on as well. Another method are using these types of pyrotechnical pistol cartridges. So they're basically little fireworks in a .22 gun. And so you can have either whistlers or these other bangers that make loud noises, and you can basically chase birds out of the field by using these types of things. And then your traditional, what you would have, at a lot of backyard people have pie plates in their gardens to try to keep birds away, or some other type of noisemakers. Then there's the visual deterrents. And some examples, again, these are where it gets kind of funny. You have these scare eye type balloons, streamers or flashers, some lights or mirrors, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some light work that we've done, and also such things as hawk silhouettes, stuffed owls, and so on. A lot of times you see on people's boats, they'll have an owl, like a plastic owl, for example, on a boat, and that's just to try to keep the birds from making a mess, let's just say, on people's boats. And so there's just an example of these kites, and this is a kite, and the bird will flap in the vineyards and try to deter other birds from entering. But I'll talk a little bit about that type of stuff in a little bit. One of the most expensive methods, but again, one of the ones with greatest control, is using netting. And it's a physical extrusion. The birds cannot get access to the fruit, especially if the nets are of good quality without a lot of large holes. And so they can be installed in a vineyard setting, just in the fruiting zone, such as this one, over the entire rows in this type of situation. Or a very expensive way of doing it is actually netting the entire field with overhead netting. And this is common in certain places of the world. I think New Zealand is an area where they do a lot of entire vineyard netting. So that gets pretty expensive. And to get into some interesting options, there are some chemical repellents. A lot of these aren't registered anymore, but there are a few natural type of chemical compounds, like methylantranilate, for example, is a compound, and there's some that are based on that. Falconry is another option where people with trained birds, predator birds, they bring them into the field, and the other birds, the predator birds, chase them away. And here's an example of a Cooper's hawk down here that was actually in one of the vineyards, and one of our collaborators actually took that picture. Trapping of birds, and this is an example of a bird trap, and they either relocate the birds when they've been trapped or they're euthanized. Shooting, obviously, the best way to get rid of your bird problem is to eliminate the problem. And I had to take this picture, use this picture just because of the lab. I'm a lab guy, and he's using a nice Benelli Super Black Eagle semi-auto, so that's a good way to get rid of your starling problem. Other options are UAVs. Now are becoming more common. And this is an example of a UAV that looks like a bird right up here, and it's trying to mimic this bird actually right here. And there's actually been some work done also in Michigan State University using some of these things like these air dancers. So if you've seen that, they're just a random movement. It's pretty goofy, but they have had some success, but they've also had success of scaring neighbors' dogs and owners' dogs and stuff, because it freaks them out as well. And we're talking here in a farm situation, but if you look at airports, they're using pretty much all of these types of things because that's it's a safety issue. Whereas in the fields, in the farmers' fields, it's a little bit of a different issue in terms of what we're trying to do is that we have different problem species in each situation. So different birds will respond differently depending on the type of bird they are and the environment that they're in. So for this talk, I'm strictly talking about agriculture situations. And in our area, these are the two most common problematic birds because they're in such high numbers. There's probably other birds that do more damage per bird number, but in terms of the two most problem ones that we have in Ontario vineyards, it's the European starling here and the American robin. And part of the issues with the starlings is you can just get these huge flocks of them that come in by tens of thousands, and they'll just eat a lot of fruit all at once. And before you know it, you blink your eye, and they've consumed a lot of fruit. Whereas the robins are more persistent, and they're ground feeders. And here's just an example of a robin down here that they get into the vineyard. They don't fly in necessarily from over top, but they sneak in from along the sides. And once they're in, they just kind of hop up and just keep feeding. So those are some of the problematic birds, and I want to talk about how they feed, because that does impact when I talk later on in terms of how the deterrents worked and how they didn't work, and what were some of the issues. So in terms of when you're talking about controlling birds, you usually need a combination of deterrents. There's just not one fail-safe one. Like if you look at ice wine production here in Ontario, everybody nets the grapes. One is so the grapes don't fall on the ground, but the other thing is bird pressure becomes extremely high, especially once there's no leaves in the canopy, and the birds have a visual cue of, whoa, look at that huge supply of food in a time when there's not a lot of food, especially when there's a lot of snowfall and so on. So you usually use that, but they may use some bangers as well to try to just keep them from not entering the block to begin with. So this can be time consuming, it's expensive, and when birds are hungry, they're smart. Like whoever came up with the thing bird brain actually is a bird brain, because they're super, super smart. Like they are very smart animals. And if you do any type of training with a bird or with a dog or anything, you really understand that most animals are pretty intelligent creatures. And they have to be when they're trying to survive, right? Like they don't have the luxury of us being protected in a lot of situations. These have to survive on their own. And so a lot of these methods that are very common can be problematic, especially when you have that urban pressure on a traditional farm. And so a lot of these noisemakers can be problematic with neighbors. So in recent years, there's been a lot of interest from our industry to look at some different bird deterrent technologies that may provide not only safe control, but also very effective control without a lot of these other options. And again, it's giving farmers more options to use to help deter a problem in their fields. And you do all that work during the growing season, and then at the end of the year, all of a sudden birds can come wipe you out. It's really frustrating when you've done everything in your power to grow the best possible fruit and as much as you can. So some of the objectives of the project that we have here that we've been working on a number of different deterrents is, one is to test the efficacy of these and see how they work in terms of preventing bird damage. The other is to develop methods for quantifying bird pressure and estimating how much bird pressure there is in the field in different years. And then determine how these bird deterrents are actually impacting bird behavior and activity and the presence of species, or certain species being, I shouldn't say eliminated, but being deterred from the area, or other ones just not affected by it. And finally, look at improve an estimation of how much damage there is in the field, because you don't really know how much damage there is. When we start doing this work, you can start to really understand, there's a lot of damage out there that we're not really seeing. So the first deterrent I want to talk about is a light-based deterrent. And here's just an example of this light deterrent. And the setup here, this was in a vineyard, but there's also an adjacent pear orchard to the block. And this was set up in Niagara Lake, Ontario. And here's just an example in a different field of just how the light would look to us with our naked eye looking across the block. So we had these lights set up above the canopy row, and we looked to see how effective these were based on some of those objectives I just had up there. So in the first year, in 2013, we had 8 sites, and we looked at some of our important wine grape varieties. So we looked at Riesling, Pinot Gris blocks, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, a couple Cab Franc and a Cab Sauv, as well as 1 Merlot block. And then in 2014, we didn't have as many of these units, and we cut it down to 4 blocks and focused on some of the blocks that were of interest in 2013. So we looked at a Chardonnay block, a Pinot Noir block, a Cabernet Franc block, and then a Cabernet Sauvignon block that was destined for ice wine. So again, we're going to use this deterrent for a longer extended period of time and to see how it impacted bird activity and bird damage. So some of the criteria for our sites, and we worked with an industry panel to select these vineyard sites. One of the criteria was that we needed a power supply, because at the time, and I still think it is to this day, the light-based deterrent needed a power supply, AC power. So that was the number one requirement. We also wanted to have sites that were going to be higher pressure sites. So we worked with Hugh Fraser at Omafra, and he has a lot of experience with birds. And so he knew traditionally vineyards that had really high bird pressure. So we used some of his information and talked to a lot of growers and so on. And we looked at some of these criteria, right? You need food, water, and shelter. So these are some of the things that we were looking at in terms of what birds require, and that's going to make it a better site. The other thing was remoteness of other bird deterrents, especially acoustical bird deterrents. If a bird banger is going off in an adjacent block, it's going to skew the information that we get. So again, that was another criteria, and there were some great blocks that we could have worked with, but the growers would not remove their bangers. In terms of the setup of the block, we developed this 5 strata system. So we have these 4 exterior regions of the block and then an interior region, and this was based on some previously published research. And so from this, we were able to collect information based on the spatial distribution and look at the variability of damage and activity within a block. So this is just one example of each block was set up differently based on how we could get a control area and a treated area. So based on the manufacturer's recommendations, they basically said this is the area that will be covered by the deterrent, and so we set up another control area further away. We tried to have similar environmental conditions with both the control and the treatment area. However, that's really, really difficult to do, but we tried our best. And this is one thing I have to say right off the bat, is this type of work is not easy, to try to set up a really, really strong control and a really strong treatment. So in terms of one of the things we did was we assessed bird activity, and we monitored this weekly. We looked at the abundance and distribution of different bird species monitored at each site. And this was done at 10-minute intervals at 3 positions. So we had 2 people standing up on ladders or step ladders in the exterior of the blocks and the corners of the blocks, and then we had somebody else in the interior. And they all had data sheets with them, and what they would do is look at birds flying over, into and out of the blocks, flying inside the rows, and where birds were on tree lines and power lines. So again, we're getting a good assessment of where the birds are, what birds they are, and what are they doing. The other thing we looked at is bird damage assessments. And so in this case, we're using a scale, and this would be a 1 with no to minimal damage. This would be more of a 2 with some damage on the clusters. And then these are the more severe, we're looking at a 4 or 5 on the scale, where there's a lot of damage. And so we were able to qualify it that way and then quantify it through some linear regression graphs. So we could actually quantify what kind of damage we'd have. And we would do this on flagged vines. We had vines flagged throughout the vineyard block. They're all GPS located. And we did the analysis or the assessments on these blocks. And they were random assessments because when you're out in the field, your eyes are going to look for those damaged clusters, right? So we actually used dice and rolled them in the field, and they're based on the position of the vine and the height of the vine. So we didn't have any personal visual bias when we did the assessments. It was all done through rolling the dice, literally. And then what we did was when we selected those clusters, we rotated them and looked all over. So to get a really good assessment of damage, this is what you really have to do. And if you're a farmer just going out and saying, oh, well, I have tons of bird damage, well, you might not actually, because you're just gravitating to that row or that panel that got decimated, but the rest of it might not be so bad. In other cases, you might miss the damage. So this is just an example of some of the bird activity that we had at some of the blocks and versus the control and versus the treated areas. And you can see the data is pretty much all over the place. And we had these charts here in these Cabernet Franc blocks. We have huge numbers of bird counts. This is their average per week. It's over 500 birds. So there's a lot of activity in these types of fields. If you want to know the location of this block, this is more near the airport in Niagara Lake. So if you're a local grower or just a local person here in the Niagara region, that is an area where there's a lot of starling flocks moving through. And that's where we saw some of the work here, was that we saw some huge amounts of flocks moving through some of these blocks. In other blocks, what we found was that there wasn't a lot of number of birds, but these birds that were, let's say in this Pinot Noir block, they did end up ultimately causing a lot of damage. Even though the numbers aren't that high, there was actually a lot of damage in the block. So again, more damage per bird basis. But again, we wanted to look at the sense of, okay, how does this bird deterrent impact bird activity? And what we did find was that it seemed to limit these big, large flocks from flying into and out of the blocks. So we reduced the numbers in the high flocking situations, but overall, we didn't find a lot of difference in terms of impacting number of birds in the vineyard blocks. But again, highly variable based on site and variety. So in terms of the most common birds, again, the robins and the starlings were the highest numbers that we saw, but also finches were quite bad as well as some sparrows. In terms of birds being observed actually eating grapes, the robins, bluebirds, which is another thrush, they were found eating grapes as well as sparrows and finches. Surprisingly though, we didn't see any starlings eating grapes. It was really interesting. And then there was a researcher from Cornell that was here this fall, or this winter I should say, and he said the same thing. They haven't found starlings eating grapes. We know they do, but we don't see them doing it, or at least we think they do. So we saw heavy flocking behavior at some of the blocks. Like I showed you those 2 Cabernet Franc blocks, we had some serious flocking behavior there, but it wasn't regularly observed. And it did change as the season went on. Later in the season, you start seeing the numbers of starling flocks really start to increase. And again, some sites were worse. And what I also found was raptors were natural deterrents. When there was a hawk in the vineyard, for example, the number of birds just across the board dropped down, or they weren't as active. They were just hiding in the tree lines and so on. And that'll help get into the second deterrent strategy I'm going to talk about here. So in terms of the initial bird damage, this is an interesting graph. By the time we got these units, they came from New Zealand. We had just started to turn Vraizen, which the grapes start to turn color, and Pinot Noir is one of the earlier ones. And before we could even get these out, like the grapes weren't even turned, there was already damage in the Pinot Noir. And the same thing with some Chardonnay. We already had some initial damage and a little bit in the Cab Sauv. The birds were really hungry this year. They went right for the grapes right away. In other varieties, there was no difference at all right at the beginning. No damage. That's what we wanted to see. But in some instances, we had some damage. I just want to put that into consideration. I want to show you the next one. So that was the original initial damage for these different blocks. And then moving into the mid-assessment, so this would have been done more in September, you could see here that there was some increased damage in the Chardonnay in the controlled areas, as well as in the Pinot Noir and the Cabernet Sauvignon. The rest of the blocks either had no bird damage, and then again, these are these blocks that had those huge numbers of starling flocks and so on. There's not a lot of damage occurring in those blocks. And again, that has something to do with variety too, just to put it out there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The final assessments, we noticed a big difference. This one here, so there was some success with the control and the mid assessments, but the final assessment we did end up having more damage in the final treatment, block. However, that deterrent stopped working one weekend. The photocell on it stopped working, and as soon as that went off, we had a huge influx of damage, which was interesting to us and to the grower. We did observe that, and he had even mentioned that when that wasn't working, there was a lot more activity and stuff happening in the block. But in some of the other blocks, we had very good control with this light-based deterrent. This Pinot Blanc block had less damage. Merlot, the Pinot Noir, again, we had some initial damage to begin with, so that we felt it had some control there, as well as in the Cabernet Sauvignon block. But looking at those Cab Franc blocks, even though it seemed to reduce the big flocks of the starlings, there was still more damage actually in the treated blocks than the control. So a bit of a dog's breakfast out there, right, in terms of the results. It's nothing too consistent. We did this again in 2014, again, just with the 2 sites. Again, we found some slight control in Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, but at the end of the day, there's still a lot of damage in the blocks. This is the final assessment, so you could still see this was in the ice wine block, and so look how much damage can occur in an ice wine block. 50% loss due to birds. And Pinot Noir also a variety that sustained a lot of damage regardless of the treatment. So there's something to say about variety for sure that we've learned, that certain varieties are definitely more susceptible than a variety such as Riesling. In terms of where the damage is occurring, I don't want to get into all the numbers or anything here, but just look at the colors. And most of the damage is occurring on the edge of the vineyards. edge of the fields. I mean, that's what you would expect. But again, when you collect the data, you could actually say for sure. And generally what happens is when you have an increased amount of damage on the exterior, you'll start getting more and more damage in the interior of the block. And there's something else to be said with that is, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but that's also the percentage of fruit that's out there. If you have a lot of fruit, you won't necessarily have as much damage. But if you're in a small block, and some of these blocks that we're looking at were quite small, if you're in a small block, or if you've had a block that's had some winter injury, for example, and there's not a lot of fruit out there, you will have more damage, more percent damage. And we found this as well as some of our colleagues at Michigan State University. It's also been doing similar work to this out of the Lindell lab at Michigan State. She's found very similar stuff in terms of percentage of damage and abundance of fruit. But this chart here, just looking at some relationships between areas of the vineyard where there's greater activity, such as in these strata, and also more damage. Again, this is a nicer looking graph. In some instances, there isn't really a great relationship between the total activity and the damage, and a lot of that, again, has to do with species. Certain birds are much worse than others, and what we're finding, especially with this, with the light deterrent, is that it seems to work better for starlings and so on, but you get into robins that are feeding along the edge. They enter the vineyard through underneath the vines, then they get in, they just kind of hop around and they just feed like crazy. Whereas if it's a bird that's coming from up top, the light seems to have a better effect. That's what we found after 2 years. And this is an example of how progression of damage can look like, what it can look like when over time during the course of the growing season. So here's an example in a Cabernet Sauvignon block, and the deterrent was set up here in the north part of the block. And there's some tree line. There's a tree line right here. I think it's a cedar mixed tree row. And then there's another block of trees down this way. And you can see initially there was no damage in the control area, and the treated area had a little bit of damage around where the tree line was. However, we started to see more damage in the control area over time, and then a lot more getting into November. And the damage still, and even in the area with the bird control or the bird treated area with the light, we still saw some damage along the area where the trees were. So again, if they find shelter, doesn't matter if they're deterrent, they feel safe, and they'll just go back and forth and just get easy access. Now it's interesting when you look at the same block and we left it till ice wine harvest. So if you could just try to keep your eyes to the left, because the right's kind of striking, but at the beginning, again, we had some better control in the area with the light, and in the controlled area down at the bottom, we had some increased incidence of bird damage. And again, it expanded more. And when you get into October, come December, when there's no leaves on the vines and the pressure really started to increase, we saw a lot of damage even in the area with the bird deterrent there, and a lot of damage in the control area. So it just shows. And you wonder why a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon ice wine is very expensive. Look at the losses, and that's part of the reason why it's a rare, luscious drink, and it's very prestigious. It's because of look at the risk the farmer's taking. I think this is a good example of that in this. And so you would use a lot of different types of deterrents. This had netting, this had the light, and I think there was even a banger somewhere in the vicinity, just because the grower wanted to use all the protection they could. So in terms of the general conclusions with the light-based deterrent, we found there was a lot of bird pressure that varied between the sites as well as the sampling dates. And we saw later in the season, the numbers can increase, and I'll show you another table later on in the talk that explains that a little bit more. The damage increased as the season progressed. Again, this is also bird pressures increasing, and as more grapes are being harvested, again, there's all kinds of fruit out there, and then all of a sudden, the adjacent block gets harvested, the other block behind it gets harvested. Next thing you know, you got this isolated block all of a sudden. which it wasn't getting a lot of damage and bird pressure initially, but as other things get picked around it and there's less fruit in the entire region, all of a sudden birds will move to that area. So it's something to be mindful of if you're a grower. So again, that less fruit generally equals more damage, more percentage damage. Again, most of the damage occurs in the exterior, which a lot of growers already know, but it does move into the interior the more severe you get. So if you think, oh, I've got damage on the outside rows, I'm okay, you might want to start checking the interior of the block because you might be starting to have more damage. What we found in terms of the light-based deterrents, that the treatment blocks seem to have some better control of the large starling flocks, but robins did not appear to be bothered. 2 years of research, and it seemed like a lot of the variability behind our data had to do a lot with robins and the presence of robins. 2014, robins were a real issue in vineyards around here. And other years, starlings might be more of an issue. And so those robins are really difficult to control. And like we've been monitoring, birds for a number of years now, and we've actually seen them land on top of a bird banger, like a robin, not even care. It goes off, they'll move, then they'll come right back to it. So they're pretty stubborn. And they're very smart birds. One of the issues that we had was the fact that these lights needed a power source requirement. So we couldn't put it in the perfect spot that we would really like to, just because of the extension cord requirement and so on and so forth. So that we're going to continue this work this year and move it outside of just grapes, but look also at some other earlier fruit crops like blueberries. So this goes to the second type of deterrent that we've started doing work with, and this is using American Kestrels. And American Kestrels this is an example, this is a picture of an American Kestrel. It's a small falcon, and it's a native bird to North America, and they're widely distributed across North America. And the cool thing about an American Kestrel compared to a lot of other birds of prey is that you can actually attract it to a nest box. So if you have the right conditions and the right kind of habitat for it, they're cavity nesters. So they normally would nest in snags and trees and so on. But as we know, those types of situations don't exist that much anymore. A lot of people don't want to see a tree that's dead, so they cut it down. And so our cavity nesters are on a decline in generally speaking, partly because of starlings, but partly because of lack of habitat. And so you're able to actually attract a beneficial bird to your orchard, to your vineyard, to your field. And while these birds a lot of their diet don't depend on other bird species, they will eat the odd small bird like a sparrow, what have you, but they feed mostly on arthropods, so like grasshoppers and so on, and small mammals like voles and mice and so on. So they're a pretty cool bird and very, very, very beautiful. So we've started working on this project in informal collaboration with Michigan State University, but through work with Susan Fitzgerald and OFVGA and funding through the OMAFRA Wildlife Conflict Strategy. So in terms of the nest box locations, we have 16 of them up across southern Ontario. Most of them are in the Niagara Peninsula, but we do have some in Norfolk County as well. And so we have a lot of wine grapes, some cherries and blueberries, and we even have one in a sweet corn field. So in terms of the reason why you see the yellow here is indicating where we were successful having kestrels. So this is, of all the boxes we have up here, these are where we successfully had American Kestrels occupy the boxes. But in some other boxes, we did get some other native birds nesting, which are beneficial, increasing biodiversity, but some of them are also good for eliminating pests in the orchard or vineyard anyways. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So in terms of general methodology, what we did was we monitored the nest boxes during the breeding season. So we wanted to make sure that we were maintaining the boxes, we cleaned them out, and we're also discouraging non-native birds. Unfortunately, starlings are a cavity nester as well. And so if if the boxes aren't located in an ideal situation and something else doesn't take over the box, likely you're going to get a starling. So you have to be active in terms of monitoring these boxes and discouraging the non-native birds. So once we had occupancy in the boxes, what we did was we observed them for for egg laying and young, and we looked at when they fledged and so on and so forth. And we also monitored the kestrels themselves and what they were doing while they were there. And we also looked at, similar to the light deterrent, we looked at things like bird counts, bird activity, and bird behavior. And if we were successful with a kestrel pair, we then looked at damage in that block where the box was. We do have some information online of what type of requirements kestrels need. So you can get nest box designs and tower designs of what we were using online. And please contact me if you're interested. I could send you the link as well. So this is an example of, this is at the Vineland Station and on Cherry Avenue. And you can see here that this is a pair of kestrels that we had nesting there. So the picture's a little bit blurred to zoom in, but here's a male kestrel and here's a female kestrel together, paired up, just sitting on some trees on the outside of the vineyard block. Here's an example of shots from a GoPro camera. So we were able to observe inside the boxes to see what's inside the box. And these were shots during the season of the adult kestrel here. Here's an example of what kestrel eggs look like, and 4 eggs in the box. And you can see they just nest on the substrate they don't lay, or so they don't build a nest. They use just some wood shavings that you place at the bottom of the box. And here's some of the real young with the mother, and then here are some of the babies later in the season. So you can see there's all kinds of carcasses and pellets and so on at the bottom of the box. It gets pretty messy by the end of the day, end of the season. So that's why you have to be responsible when you put up some of these boxes to make sure that the animal care is the priority. So, in terms of the boxes where we had kestrels, what were some of the things that the kestrels did? What we did find was that the kestrels did impact the amount of birds there, the counts, as well as the distribution of the birds. And overall, what we found was that there was a reduction in starling populations. So when the kestrels weren't there, we had higher numbers of starlings compared to when they were there. And overall, bird counts were less when the kestrels were present. And we found this in both years, and there was some significant results here as well statistically. So it was really, really interesting. And what we also found was that it did alter the starling behavior. When the kestrels were up high flying around, the starlings were not necessarily in the vicinity of the block. They would move outside of the area. And just an example of a kestrel coming to the box to feed its young and having other birds displace, and it just disturbed a lot of the other birds around. And at times, other predators were also found to be higher when they were there as well. So it was kind of a weird, I don't know if it's just a coincidence or what, but when the kestrels were there, we also had a higher number of raptors, which again, like I said earlier, were also, when those birds of prey are around, the bird population really decreases in the block. So not only just kestrels, but other birds as well. So there's just an example of a picture of the kestrel. Can you see her there? Just I think it's a her, maybe it's a him, hanging out, putting the food in the box. So when the kestrels are actively laying eggs and there's young at the box, they can be very aggressive. And that's the time where we found that the kestrels were most efficient in terms of helping deter other birds. Later in the season, they don't hang around as often, and we found that they didn't have as great of an impact, obviously, if they're not there as often. So in terms of, again, the number of birds recorded at these sites, it did change as the season progressed, just like we saw with the light work. But we also found that when the birds were there, we also found that it changed where the birds were in terms of changing their behavior. So we found that when the kestrels were kicking around, they weren't flying over the blocks as much, but they were going more to the tree lines and waiting for the birds to leave and feeling safe. So when the kestrels were there, it did impact their behavior for sure. Were they actively feeding on the birds? No, from what we observed, but we had one pair that were very, very aggressive near Short Hills. And the grower there said that he would watch the kestrels actively chase starlings and other birds out of the block. And we do have some images of that they were actually feeding on birds at that site, but most of the other places, it was mostly non-avian prey. And a lot of mammal prey. So here's an example of a kestrel carrying probably a vole or something. You can see it right there if you know what you're looking for, I guess. But just take my word for it. Here's an example of a kestrel with a bird carcass at one of the sites. So this is where we did see some prey of other avian species, but again, that doesn't make up a large portion of their diet. And the work out of Michigan State have really looked at what they feed on, and a lot of what they feed on are arthropods, but they will feed a lot on the mammalian prey as well, and some birds. But this was one welcome visitor that we have had in this project, is the eastern screech owl. So the screech owl is an owl species that is also a cavity nester. And so we put up this box. It was brand new last December, not last summer, December before. And we go to monitor it. I think we went there to put wood chips in. And long and behold, there's a screech owl sticking his head out, warming himself in the morning sun. Screech owls are, again, a native bird, and they eat everything. They're very, very good birds to have. They eat a lot of mice and voles, and in the winter they'll actually stack them up in the boxes. They'll eat other birds as well. So they're very good to have. And so in the winter months, especially if you have a young orchard or vineyard and you have a lot of problems with vole damage, putting one of these boxes can be really beneficial to help mitigate some damage that occurs in crops, but not directly crop related, but in terms of overall plant health, because there's a lot of animals that will feed off the bark and kill the plant. So this was really, really interesting to see these guys. And again, this year, we found the same thing. We've got some screech owls in some of the boxes. So in terms of some of the summary of the American kestrel boxes, we've had some success at a couple of the vineyard sites, and we had another pair at the orchard, but they didn't lay any eggs, or didn't have any young, I should say. So overall, we've had seven successful offspring in 2015. Like I showed, we found that they can impact the numbers of the birds as well as the activity and behavior. So they do have some limited impact on controlling damage. I didn't show the data, but we did a little bit of work in the first year in the vineyard block when there was some crop on the impact of kestrels on controlling damage, and it was minor. And later in the season, it didn't work at all, mainly because the birds weren't there. So for grapes, it may not be as advantageous with the kestrels in terms of controlling damage, but again, they may have an indirect impact of controlling other birds and leading up into the harvest season of just reducing your overall bird population. However, with fruits that are maturing at the same time as kestrel nesting, let's say, so for other crops like cherries or blueberries, what have you, they might be very, very successful, but we've yet to do any work in any of those crops where we've had the kestrel at the same time as the fruit maturity. But some growers that we've talked to have put up some kestrel boxes, and they've had very good control in strawberries and a couple other things. So that's good to know. And again, we found that other native birds did utilize the boxes. Again, this is good for farmers. I mean, to increase their biodiversity, but also can reduce the impact of farming on the native habitat and native birds, and also at the same time, those birds can be a real benefit to eating problematic insects and so on. So we've had bluebirds in the boxes with success, northern flickers, wrens, tree swallows. So birds that generally don't cause any issues with the crops you're growing, but can again help with some of the insect populations, which can be a bit of a nuisance. So we're really excited about this actually because of the potential benefits, and we're hoping this year that we can attract more American kestrels, and we're learning more and more every day about what's best to attract them, and site location is really, really important. If you have a lot of large woodlots around the block, you're going to attract things like red-tailed hawks, and you're going to attract great horned owls and these types of predator birds that the kestrels don't really like, and they don't really like kestrels that much, and so that can have an impact. And you need to have habitat for the kestrels to feed at as well. So they're not going to necessarily be feeding directly at your farm, but maybe some of the surrounding areas. So if you have some open fields, they can forage there all day long and have a constant food supply. Whereas in your vineyard block or your orchard block, you might not have the same, it's more pristine, right, in terms of your management. And so you may not have as much prey for that bird. So if you have the surrounding habitat, that's really important. And they'll forage up to 1 kilometer at least. Like well, I can't think of the term now, but the area where they occupy and protect is 1 kilometer, square kilometer, generally speaking. So you cannot put up a whole bunch of these boxes close together like you would a bluebird box or a tree swallow colony or purple martins. These guys like to be a little bit more isolated. So in terms of some of the conclusions, number one, assessing bird activity and looking at bird deterrents is really challenging. And I'm newer to this, just getting into this in the last couple of years, but I've talked to some folks, researchers who have been in this type of research for 20 years, and they said it doesn't get any easier. However, a lot of the results that we're finding is really new to the field, and also we're getting a lot of agreement with other folks as well. But it's really difficult to say, this deterrent is going to be 100% effective. I don't think that exists. If it did, I think airports would have figured that out. And everyone's using a combination of deterrents. So it's usually the best one for your situation, for what you're trying to protect, and like your commodity, I should say, and those types of factors. If you have neighbors around that are going to, not like the loud noise, you may want to start looking at some other deterrents to reduce the amount of noise that you're making in the vineyard and looking at or orchard or vegetable farm, like whatever you're growing, you have to be mindful of the environment, because you might have not only neighbors but other situations that are going to increase your bird pressure or your terrestrial pressure, whether it's deer or birds, what have you. So it's really important to look at these interactions around you. What we found is that there's a lot of site-specific interactions. So different sites had different levels of bird activity that's really varied upon block or between blocks, in region, varieties grown. It really had an impact. And so the damage really varied across the sites. Either way, bird damage, it can result in a lot of loss. And like I said, even if you can't see it really easily, you probably have some loss in your fields. And I mean, birds are not trying to be difficult. I mean, it's food. They don't know that you're trying to grow it for money. They look at it the same as any other food. They're opportunistic. So you want to try to reduce their opportunity, let's say, through deterrent strategies or through lack of shelter and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is the abundance of fruit really does result in a decreased percentage of damage. So in a year where you don't have a lot of fruit, expect bird damage to be worse than in a year where there's so much fruit out there, because the birds they'll feed a little bit here, a little bit there, everywhere, because the food source is everywhere. But if food is in short supply, and like if you look at grapes, for example, in the fall, the food's starting to get a little limited, and they're trying to, get ready for the winter. And if there's this beautiful black fruit out there, and tons and tons of it, literally, hey, I'm going to go for that. And if there's lack of other fruit in the area, native fruit, for example, they're going to go to your farm. So if it's an isolated block, if it's a smaller block, you're going to be in more trouble if it's earlier maturing. And so, varieties like Pinot Noir. And I just know we didn't do any work with Baco, really. A little bit of work with the Kestrel in a Baco field, but those earlier varieties are ones that really get hammered, because as soon as that fruit turns color, they're in there. And like I said, with the Pinot Noir in the light deterrent project, they were literally picking those grapes off as soon as they turned color. So you want to get your strategies, your deterrents out earlier. You want to keep things random, and use as many tools as you can to help deter them, because they're, like I said, they're opportunistic, and they're gonna go for it when they see it. The other problem with Pinot Noir is you usually have a lighter crop on it to begin with because it's Pinot Noir. So the heartbreak grape really is the heartbreak grape on many, many levels. And the other thing that happens is you get bird damage, more disease, and you can also increase insects, problematic insects for the grape and wine industry, like ladybugs. So it's really good to have good bird control, because you can bring in a whole bunch of other problems in your vineyard blocks. And so we're hoping to look at some other commodities, but with the lights and so on. But this is the work we've done so far on grape. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our collaborators and partners. A lot of people have been involved with this project. Mary Jasinski, who's an author on the presentation, she's done so much work with this, and I'd like to acknowledge her for all of the hard work. This takes a lot of time and a lot of early mornings doing those bird activity assessments. All of our committee members and working with Hugh Fraser and Susan Fitzgerald, the industry with the GGO and OFVGA, and funding through the Ontario Vineyard Improvement Program, Everedge IP, and OMAFRA's Agriculture Wildlife Conflict strategic funding. So with that, I'll take any questions, and there's a lot I probably haven't talked about in terms of observations and so on, but it's a really interesting area of work, and it is a real big problem. And here's just an example in this picture of, we have a game camera that we put up to monitor what's happening at the boxes once we have some nest activity. And here's just an example of a whole family of kestrels at the box. So if you have fruit maturing at the same time as this, that's really good, because you've got all those kestrels very active and moving around. The box is not crooked, by the way. That's just the angle of the game camera. So thank you very much.
Jim, I have one couple of questions.
Okay.
The observation that you made where the crop is heavier, there's less damage. Is some of that also, or where it's lighter, there's more damage? Is some of that maybe also related to the sweetness of the grapes?
Could be. It could be.
Not just abundance?
Yeah, it could be the better maturity in the grapes, and a lot of times when you don't have as much crop, you might have, if it's winter injury related, you may also have a more open canopy, and so just a better visual clue to the grapes. Another practice that's widely done is fruit exposure, and increasing fruit exposure through leaf removal and so on. And so again, you're giving those birds a beautiful target to look at in terms of especially the purple grapes. And so if leaf removal might also increase damage, especially to the exterior rows.
And then did I also hear you right in the ice wine block that you were studying, where by the end of the season, whether the light deterrent was there or not, there was still excessive damage. Those grapes were netted as well.
Yeah.
So that really drives home the point that there's not one solution that's going to magically deter these birds. When they're hungry, they're going to find a way to the crop. Yeah, exactly.
When birds are hungry, they'll find a way, and the quality of the netting makes a difference. If it's a finer netting, it'll do a better job. But as you know, as a farmer, robins particularly, they'll actually get inside the netting. Like if you leave anything loose, and they'll actually get in and just hop around and feed. So even netting is not 100% effective. And it's the quality of the netting. Again, it gets so expensive to use the really, really good netting and tons of it. And then you have to seal it off perfectly, and it could be, nothing, there's no fail-safe in terms of 100%.
And the other aspect of netting is you also have to remove it prior to harvest, and that may take labor that you don't have at that time.
Yeah, so you have to look at there's a risk management factor when it comes to birds, and like how much am I willing to accept in terms of loss. But it's definitely, there's a lot of damage that does occur in blocks. And in one block 1 year might have no damage, and the next year can have a ton. And so is that something, just possibly populations of birds being high, birds migrating through? Could it be some of those issues with a more open canopy, or that fruit is just really mature that year and mature at the right time, that the birds are there? There's a lot of factors at play, and you have to be, you're definitely proactive in terms of bird control.
For instance, I know that you go to Kestrel County a lot, and I've seen like how the vineyards are often like trying much lower, like the fruit is much lower than here. I was wondering if you think, or if you know if like the bird damage is the same, like if they see the same species of bird, like if this play a role in the damage.
So the question was, in Prince Edward County, they're growing the fruit low to the ground and asking if there's more damage when the fruit is lower to the ground, or if they have more birds. Or I haven't done any work in the county with bird control, but you would have probably different species maybe feeding. Maybe the ground feeders might be worse, like robins, but I don't know for sure. The canopies also aren't as large in the county, and the crops aren't as large either, and the blocks are more isolated. So I think pressure is a lot higher in the county, and based on my discussion with growers, it seems to be, but we haven't actually collected any data to say for sure. But that's just all speculation. But
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Jim, and we've got a little bit of a present here.
Oh, thank you very much.
For you, Jim.
Thank you.
And I would also invite you all to join us next week. We have a COVI fellow from the University of Guelph speaking. It's Dr. Annette Nassouth, and she's going to talk to us about morphological and molecular markers involved in grapevine cold hardiness. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.